Communism, the idea of equality for all. For Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan, it was the logical thing to do during the Great Depression because it guaranteed a solution for all. In the late 50s and early 60s, unconditional loyalty to America was called for by the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. Miller and Kazan were among the many that were called in front of the committee, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. The goals of the committee were to find former and present members of the Communist Party to strip them of their channels of influence. However, in the case of Elia Kazan, it mattered less about the names and more that a man of his influence named names, showing the public that such a big figure as him had aligned themselves with the committee. When Kazan's career in Hollywood was threatened, he named names and did so without remorse. Miller, at the time a best friend of Kazan's, was angered that Kazan decided to name names and condoning the acts of HUAC. In response to Kazan naming names, Miller wrote The Crucible, which premiered in 1953 to provide a parallel of the current events with HUAC to the Salem witch trials of 1692 in order to explain how the situation was full of corruption and as well as to show his personal struggles. The Crucible became a major hit with the audience, but no critics would give a good review for the fear of being blacklisted. Before Kazan named names, he and Miller worked on a piece called On the Waterfront, which would be finished in 1954 by Kazan himself and Bud Schulberg. The movie is about how mafia members controlled business in the local docks and treated the actual workers horribly, until they rise up against them. Columbia Pictures wanted them to change the script so the main antagonists were communists instead of the mafia. Even after being pressured, Kazan and Miller did not want to change the plot, because Miller lived and worked on the docks with the people, and to him, he was depicting the truth. The studio wanted to change the theme up to anti-communism and make it a propaganda movie that opposes the ideology. Miller backed out of the piece altogether and received the message from the studio saying that it's funny how when we make it pro-American, you back out. In On the Waterfront, the main character, Terry Malloy, acted by Marlon Brando, was supposed to die, but in the final rendition, Kazan decided that the character representing himself would live, essentially declaring that he believed his actions regarding naming names were right and just and should have no repercussion. Miller, like Kazan, was tasked with the same act to name names when he was denied his passport on the way to London for the premiere of The Crucible, but it wasn't until 1956 that he was subpoenaed to testify. He chose to defy the committee and did not name any names, which could have ruined his career, but if it wasn't for Marilyn Monroe, his current child lover, to whom he was later married to within the same year. She used her popularity to mask Miller's profile when he was put on the news, deciding whether he was going to name names or not. The Crucible was used as an allegory to the communist trials that showed its effect on the victims and revealed the intentions of the perpetrators. The Crucible takes place in the late 1600s in Salem, Massachusetts, involving a mass witch hunt that devolved into a spiral of revenge, with many protagonists like Giles Corey and John Proctor, and antagonists like Abigail Williams and Thomas Danforth, which have real-life similar counterparts such as Miller himself, Kazan, and McCarthy. John Proctor, the main character in The Crucible, experienced many things within the play as Miller and Kazan, who had to deal with the committee. Ratting out friends, being blacklisted by the government, which was the equivalent of being hanged in The Crucible, and facing pressures of the public were all the matters faced by Kazan and Miller and their counterparts in the novel. To recap, the time of HUAC and blacklists were scary for everyone, whether or not one was a communist. The crisis created by naming names hurt people in different ways, from Kazan losing reputation to Miller losing one of his best friends and his career in Hollywood. Miller wanted to express true actions to the public about HUAC and found similar ways to represent it, hence why he wrote The Crucible, by comparing actions that Miller observed in his life to a 17th century setting filled with witchcraft and religion. Miller exposed how corrupt and unjust naming names could be.